The following podcast is a Dear Media production.
Welcome back to the Real Stuff podcast. Today's guest is someone who I have admired from afar for an incredibly long time. During the early days of COVID, back when the world felt dark and uncertain, I remember finding her free course through Yale University called The Science of Well-Being, and that is how I first met Dr. Laurie Santos. Her course genuinely changed the way that I feel about happiness and overall well-being, and after seeing her face-to-face in all of those modules on the course, it was really surreal to have her here on the podcast. Dr. Santos is a cognitive scientist, a psychology professor at Yale, and also the host of the Happiness Lab podcast. And as a podcast listener, this is one of my favorite shows to listen to. She's currently doing a series all about parenting, and that's why I decided to bring her here today. Our chat is packed with so many light bulb moments, and I think you will find many powerful takeaways from this episode. We first dive into the pressure to be perfect as a parent, and I actually discovered that I way overused the word perfect. We talk about the guilt that we carry around every little decision, and her secret sauce for becoming a happier parent overall. And just a little hint, it's not at all what you think, and it's actually by taking the easier route. We also dive into what it means to parent with more compassion, how to support your partner when both of you are running on empty, and how we can take learnings from different cultures around the world and infuse how they're parenting into how we're parenting to maybe do it a little bit better. Even if you're not a parent, there's so much you could take away from this conversation about how to live a happier, fuller, and more intentional life. So let's dive in right now with Dr. Laurie Santos. It feels very surreal to be talking to you because I took your course through Yale University over COVID. It was a very important time to be taking a course about the science of well-being. I just feel like I stared at your face and watched all these modules for weeks and weeks, and now here you are on my computer. So thank you so much for joining us on the Real Stuff podcast. The topic of happiness and the science of happiness and well-being is not only incredibly interesting to me, but universally applicable and something that everyone out there could use help with.
Totally.
Can you just tell people about that course and what got you interested in studying the science of happiness?
Yeah, well, it all started when I took on a new role at Yale. So I've been teaching there for a while now. But in just the last couple of years, I took on this role called the head of college, which sounds weird, but it's kind of like in Hogwarts and Harry Potter, where there's like kind of colleges within a college, and there's like these like magicians and faculty that live with students. That's kind of what my role was as a head of college. I was a faculty member living on campus with students. And that meant that I was seeing like the college student mental health crisis up close and personally, right? Like, you know, so many of my students were experiencing panic attacks or just really stressed out and feeling overwhelmed. And so I was watching the kind of this crisis take place in this community that I cared about so much. And so I just wanted to do something about it. And because I'm a nerdy professor, I'm like, well, the thing I can do about it is I can teach a class. I can develop a new class which teaches students all these strategies they can use to protect their mental health, and just like how they can engage in self-talk that's a little kinder, or behaviors that make you feel better, and so on. And so I kind of put the course all together. I christened it Psychology and the Good Life, so it sounded kind of cool. It would sort of pop out of the course catalog. But I didn't expect to happen what happened next, which is that not only did the course resonate with students, but it really resonated with students. A quarter of the entire Yale student body, the first year I taught the class, decided to enroll in the class. So it was over 1,000 students showed up. Yes, mild logistical nightmare to find like a classroom that fit, and like, you know, that meant that a quarter of the students were all leaving the dining hall at the same time. Anyway, it was kind of a mess, but it really showed me that students were voting with their feet, right? You know, young people don't like this culture of feeling all stressed out and anxious. And I think they kind of wanted a solution to do better. But the class also went viral off campus, which is what led to me putting the class online, to the class that you took on Coursera.org. We just heard from so many people that's like, okay, if these 19-year-old students at Yale who are incredibly privileged and have their whole life ahead of them are struggling, you know, what about the rest of us? And this was back in 2018. So by the time we put the class online, of course, we didn't know what was coming in like March of 2020, but like it just became a time that so many of us needed strategies to feel better, but also so many of us had some time on our hands, right? And I think people were just looking for things to do.
I once went to Japan as part of a video shoot, and I spent a little bit of time talking to a monk there about happiness. And he opened up to me about how when it comes to happiness, we are getting it all wrong. He said to me, you don't want to be happy all the time. We're not trying to live a life where we are happy all the time. Happiness is actually just an emotion that comes and goes, and you should feel it sometimes, and then other times you shouldn't feel it. And he sort of equated this roller coaster to something like a Disney movie where
Mhm.
there's the rising action and there's some sad moments, and then there's this peak of happiness, and then everything kind of comes back down. And he tried to explain that our lives are like this, and that your life would not be worth living or would not be enjoyable if you were just baseline happy all the time, if you didn't feel those highs and lows. As a researcher of happiness, do you agree with that? And when you're teaching happiness to people, are you trying to get them to be happy all the time, or what are you actually trying to get us to feel?
Yeah, and I completely agree with what this monk was saying. I mean, I think one of the challenges of teaching a class on happiness is that we have so many misconceptions about what it is, right? I think so many of us kind of think like what this monk was saying, right, which is about being happy all the time, right? Like, I think this gets at an idea that we often call toxic positivity, like kind of good vibes only. Like, if anything's going wrong, something's terrible. And I think that in the modern day, this has gotten even worse, right? Any mild sign of anxiety, it's not butterflies in our tummy. It's like, oh my God, I have anxiety disorder. Or any kind of sign of stress is like, oh my gosh, I'm burnt out, right? I think we can sometimes like see negative emotions as particularly bad if we assume that like we're never supposed to experience them. But like the monk says, I think what we get out of the research is that to even experience any of the highs, you have to have some of the lows. We're constantly paying attention to this contrast, right? This is why I always make fun of folks who live in Southern California who just basically stop noticing that the weather is beautiful there all the time because it's beautiful every day and you stop noticing it, right? And so I think both for noticing the good parts, we need some bad parts, but also just for a flourishing life, we need some bad parts. When you think about negative emotions, the analogy I like to use is they're sort of like that dashboard light on your car where there's like the engine light and the tire light. It's kind of a pain when those things come on, but they're really useful signals, right? Your tire light is saying, hey, something's wrong with your tire. At some point, you got to like check it out and get it fixed, or you're going to wind up,
Mhm.
crashed on the highway or something. And I think our negative emotions do the same thing for us. If you're experiencing loneliness, there's something you need to fix. If you're experiencing anxiety, that's a signal about the world that you need to pay attention to. If you're experiencing overwhelm, if you just feel like you have too much on your plate, like that's also a signal that you need to take stuff off your plate, that you need to make some changes. And so I think this monk is really onto something. We not only need negative emotions to notice the highs, we also need negative emotions as these evolved signals that are helping us kind of figure out a path that's a little bit better.
We hear a lot about celebrities who, I guess, have it all, yet we hear these stories of people like that who are still miserable or still have depression or still are, quote, unhappy. So when it comes to what we're actually chasing in life, does having more money and more career success and more material things, does that actually bring us any degree of happiness?
Definitely not as much as we think, or not as much as we like to assume. I think, particularly on money and happiness, the answer is a little bit nuanced. It is the case that if you can't put food on your table or a roof over your head, getting more money will make you happier, right? You need enough money to have your basic needs met, to have a little sense of safety and so on. And it's worth remembering, not the celebrities, but there are people out there who definitely need more money in order to function and feel like their life is flourishing, right? But my guess is most people listening to this podcast right now are not in that category, right? Definitely the celebrities that you talk about are not in that category. And definitely one more promotion, one more little piece of career success, one more moment of fame or like a blockbuster movie or whatever. Like that's actually not going to make as much of a difference as we think. And this is what we often call an affective forecasting error, right? We're kind of predicting something about our affects, something about our emotions. We're forecasting what would make it happy. But it turns out we're just really crappy at that. Most people think, listening right now, that if you earned like $100,000 or $1 million extra this year, you'd be happier. But again, if you're living above the poverty line, the research shows that that's probably not going to impact your happiness as much as you think. Or it's definitely not going to impact your happiness as much as making other changes like getting a little bit more social connection, becoming a little bit more self-compassionate, right? Taking time to rest and sleep more. Like those things are going to have a much bigger impact than the big circumstance changes that we often hear about on TikTok or on the internet. Those things don't matter as much as we think.
There was a threshold. Was it like $100,000 or something? And after that point, it doesn't actually impact your happiness?
Yeah, it was $75,000 back in 2010, which today in 2025 dollars is about 100,000, maybe a little bit more than that, right? What the research shows is once you hit that point, doubling or tripling, quadrupling your salary is not going to really make that much of a difference.
You have parlayed this Science of Wellbeing course into a parenting specific course.
Hmm.
I believe it's called The Science of Wellbeing for Parents. Are you a parent yourself?
I am not, but I actually got in my role as a head of college to interact with lots of parents, right? Because I was, this caretaker on campus for so many of their, teenage, young adult children. And what I saw was that parents were incredibly anxious, incredibly worried about their kids, kind of struggling, right? And sometimes kind of inadvertently doing stuff that, at least from what I know from the evidence, was making things worse for their kids, right? Things like intervening, being their child's alarm clock, right? When your kid's 22 years old, you're still calling him to make sure he gets up from his midterm, literally. Parents flying in to help students with laundry, any kind of crisis, maybe flying up to try to help, right? And that's not to say that, college students don't go through crises, right? At least sometimes we really do have like life or death situations on campus, but 99.999% of these aren't, right? And so what I was realizing is that, parents were really struggling with their kids getting older, but also like kind of putting in so much time and energy and so much anxiety was really making parents miserable. And so I started digging into the work, especially this new report by at the time the then Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy. He put out this sort of public health advisory called Parents Under Pressure. And so Surgeon Generals basically put out public health advisories when there's like some sort of crisis, like for the opioid crisis or the obesity
Right.
crisis or whatever. But he was putting out public health advisory just about parenting, like parenting so stressful, like dangerous to your health, right? And he just went through all the kinds of things that parents are facing, from so many more negative emotions like guilt and shame to just like not having enough time to manage things. He showed all these data reporting just how much parents are busy these days. Parents today are spending more time at work than they did 10 or 20 years ago, but they're also spending more time on childcare than they did 10 or 20 years ago. And he just talked about how something needed to give. And so we figured that just both based on my own personal experience with what parents were going through and what we were kind of hearing nationally, that like parents needed some specific resources for how they could protect their own mental health while also raising kids that were thriving.
Do you know if that public health advisory was mainly speaking about parents of young kids or if it's just parents in general?
Just parents in general. The advisory talked about kind of some of the unique challenges that parents of young children are facing, right? With working more often, right? Often not having the kind of social support that you need for time off with toddlers and that kind of thing. But the report also talked about unique challenges modern parents are facing with older kids, right? This is the first generation of parents that have really had to navigate this moment of new technology, right? Where we have smartphones that connect kids
Mm-hmm.
to real dangers online, real things that might be affecting their mental health. And, parents often can't look back to, well, how did I deal with smartphones? Because we were young enough that, we didn't have them, or even millennials who had them had the little flip phone that wasn't connecting to
Right.
TikTok and, giving you this constant stream of information. And so I think the modern challenges that Dr. Murthy were talking about were for parents of kids of all ages, right? That's kind of sad because it means it doesn't necessarily get any easier when your kids get out of diapers or when they get into grade school, or honestly, even when they go off to college.
So I'm a parent of very young kids. I have a 3.5-year-old and an 8-month-old.
Sorry to suggest it's not going to get any better, but it's still, more challenges are on their way. Yeah.
I know more challenges are coming up ahead. The place that I'm currently in is that every little thing in the day just feels so stressful and heavy and so important. Every little detail, everything from if my toddler is going to eat his lunch today to what classes do I need to sign him up for, to is my baby hitting her milestones and how many teeth are coming in. And there are just so many things on our minds all day. I'm speaking for me and my husband. We go through the day. We both work full time. We're lucky enough to work from home, but we're here and we're in it, and the tension is high.
Hmm.
Then the kids go to bed, and we look at each other and we're like, oh, it's not that hard. Everything's okay. Why did I get so stressed in that moment? Or why, when I took my son to that birthday party and he didn't want to participate, why was I getting such a physical reaction to it?
Hmm.
And now in hindsight, nothing is as big of a deal as it seems. Are all these little things that we're stressed about really a huge deal in terms of how our kids come out, and is every decision vital and important? And then if not, how can we remember that in the moment and live in the present moment feeling like things are calm, cool, and collected?
Yeah. Well, first, just to kind of like level set, right? You are not alone. I feel like so many parents go through exactly what you're going through, where it feels like every little thing from tying the shoes to getting off to drop off on time to like your kid didn't, participate in this birthday party the right way. Everything feels like a deal breaker, right? And that's like, it's worth noting that that's normative, right? Like so many people are going through that. It makes sense that you're feeling anxious, guilty, overwhelmed, worried about whether you're doing it right. This is modern parenting, right? You're not alone. So let's just kind of like acknowledge and validate, like it makes sense,
Thank
right?
you.
That said, it's probably not the healthiest way for you to go about raising your kids. Not healthy for you. And that anxiety is probably not healthy for your kids either, right? One of the big themes of this science of well-being for parents class is the fact that parents and kids experience a lot of emotional contagion, right? So if you're anxious about the
Oh,
birthday
yeah.
party, if you're upset and overwhelmed about drop off, like they're going to catch that even really at the young ages that your kids are at, right? And so it's kind of not healthy for you. It makes you feel crappy and maybe not perform your best, but it's also not great for them. And so even though it's kind of normative and it makes sense, what we need is just some strategies in the moment to kind of regulate that stuff. And one of the big ones we talk about in the course is this idea of parenting for the future. Sometimes every little tiny thing that we're doing day to day feels like, the massive test, like that is like the SAT moment, right? But really it's just one drop off. It's just one birthday party. It's just one dinner, like where they might eat something, crappy and not get their vegetables in, whatever it is. And that kind of realizing that like this is a sum total thing, it's not about every single thing every day, can be really powerful. There's also evidence that this idea of parenting for the future can make parents kind of do things that are healthier for their kids. Because sometimes I think when those individual moments feel overwhelming, we just want them fixed and solved as quickly as possible. And that's what can tend to lead to things like overparenting, right? Take an example. Your kid is trying to learn how to tie their shoes, right? Hopefully, eventually they're going to get it because they're going to have to go off to college without you showing up every morning to tie their shoes. But like that particular Thursday morning when they're really late for drop off and you just like want the shoes on, it can be tempting to go in and just like tie it for them so we can just get out the door. But at some point, you're going to have to suck it up and let them struggle through it. Like at some point, it's going to take like, the 20 minutes while they sort out tying their shoes. That's what they need to learn. If you're parenting for like this Thursday, then you just want the kid out the door. But if you realize you're parenting for when they're 30 and you're not going to be there to tie their shoes, that can let you take a breath and say, it's normal that this is going to take a while. It's normal that this is going to be frustrating, but let me just like give myself space to kind of go through it. And that distinction, that difference can be huge for parents. Like it can mean the difference between emotionally just feeling overwhelmed all the time at every little thing and giving yourself a breath. It's not going to be perfect. It is just going to take a while. That's normal. Let's just let it go the way it needs to go.
That's so true. And I sometimes try to pull myself out. And I guess without using the phrase parenting for when they're 30, that's kind of what I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking to myself, really, at the end of the day, what is the most important takeaway that my child gets from their childhood? And at the end of the day, the answer is always just, I want them to feel safe and loved
Yep.
and accepted.
Yep.
And so
Yep.
at the end of the day, it's like if I could just apply that lens to every situation that we're in, obviously there's going to be the stress, there's going to be the meltdowns and the tantrums and the crying and whatever. But as long as I'm not allowing those emotions to just leach onto me, I feel like I can then just take the approach of I did the best job that I could as a parent.
Yeah. And it's also remembering that like that best job doesn't mean the perfect job all the time,
Mhm.
right? To allow those emotions not to leach onto you, like you need to be able to take breaks. And sometimes you're not going to have the opportunity to do that. And sometimes you're going to scream back and you're going to feel really guilty about that, right? But like that's just normal parenting. And so I think giving ourselves some grace that this is a hard job. It's always been a hard job. It's especially hard now, that it makes sense that we're having some struggles with it. It makes sense that we're going to screw up sometimes. That doesn't make us a bad parent, right? I think it's our own judgment of ourselves sometimes that can like really make this a hard job. But if you can find ways to remember that it's like normal to not be perfect, give yourself some self-compassion, that can make a huge difference.
I forget where I heard this suggestion, but someone suggested every day when you and your partner come back from work and you guys regroup with each other to share with one another sort of what percentage your tank is running on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like if your partner comes to you and says, I'm running on 10% today,
Mm-hmm.
you as their partner adopt the 90% so that you guys can always be 100%. And hopefully it's a give and take and it's a back and forth, and hopefully it's not always one partner that's on 10%. But something that I definitely find myself doing with my husband is if I'm noticing, you are talking about these emotions being contagious. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I notice he's getting really stressed out by something that's happening, and I'm noticing that our toddler is being affected by it in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And his energy is changing, and all of a sudden he's looking at my husband with this face of what's going on with daddy? Why is daddy being like this? It's just heightening all around. The tensions all around are rising. And
Yes.
I sometimes will step in and I'll see that my husband's getting flustered, and I will just tell him, get in the car and go do something.
Yep.
Go drive somewhere. Go get gas. Go pick up the thing you needed at CVS. Just leave the house and I will take over. And he does the same for me if it's ever a moment where I'm, I cannot collect myself. And so I think there's something to be said too about it's one thing to listen to these podcasts and hear experts tell you how you should feel or how everything shouldn't be a big deal and you should be parenting for the future. But when you're in the moment, sometimes you just can't control the emotions that you have. And the best thing to actually do is to remove yourself from the situation and let a more stable partner take over for you temporarily.
Totally. And this is one of the practical strategies that we talk a lot about in this class, right? Is this idea of like noticing where you're at, maybe noticing where your partner's at, and like acting accordingly. This is what self-compassion researcher Kristen Neff talks about in this practice of mindfulness, right? But not mindfulness in the way we think of like meditation. Mindfulness just like noticing like I am on 10%, like I'm on my last nerve. I'm ready to start slamming stuff around and just or I am just like, if I do not rest and get away from these folks, I'm like going to say something stupid, right? Like you need to have a moment of like, oh, actually, that's the part like I'm ashamed of this, but this is where I'm at, right? And then just like a kind of common human experience of like, okay, that's where you're at. Like that's just the way it is. Like you need to take a walk. You need to like go do something in the bathroom for a much longer time than you would normally need to be in the bathroom, right? Like you need to get away, right? And I think that, that's great if you have a stable partner who can kind of help you and take over. Not everyone has that, but you still need to do something to kind of help yourself out. I think even like to a toddler, like mommy's having a really tough day today, so I'm just gonna like take a little bit of time in the bathroom, sit on the screen and play, or like do something like I'm gonna be right back, and then just go in and take a few breaths. But I think giving yourself permission to be at 10%, giving yourself permission to need that break, to ask for help if you have a partner or someone else, another caregiver, another support person that you can ask for help. I think the problem isn't so much often that we need that help. That's a problem too. But the part of it is that we refuse to ask for it, right? We refuse to acknowledge how much we're struggling. And that's what the mindfulness is about. It's like you can't fix it if you're not acknowledging it.
We all know that there are science-backed strategies that we can be doing to improve our own personal well-being, getting in movement, meditation. I don't know. I'm just rattling off things that we,
Mm-hmm.
quote, should be doing that we know will be beneficial for us. But you also just mentioned that parents these days are working longer hours than they've ever worked historically, and also parenting and spending time with their kids for longer hours, which those two things are kind of butting up against each other because in the past, the parent that was primarily working was probably spending not a lot of time with the child. And then the other parent was home all day and was probably not working. Now, with these different family systems and two income households, we have a lot of families where both parents are working, and then all the time they're not spent working, they're spending with their kids, or at the very least, trying to get sleep. But how can we find the time to do all these things that we know we're supposed to be doing? There's always a little bit of extra time in the day. It's just that right now we're filling that time with the things we think we need to unwind from the stress of what we've just gone through. So for me, that's I need to have some time to just sit mindlessly on my phone, or I need to have some time to just watch a show at the end of the day. I'm not going to spend the end of my day going through a rigorous evening routine that's perfect for my mental health because that feels a little bit like extra work that I need to be
Mm-hmm.
doing. So how do
Yeah.
we muster up the strength to do all the things that are going to help us in the long run?
Yeah, I think this is really critical, right? I think sometimes when we hear about these strategies, these things we should be doing, it can sound like this laundry list of other shoulds, right? Like I should be meditating. I should be going to, my Pilates class. I should be taking time to have wonderful sex with my partner. Like I should, like there's all these shoulds that start to be like, oh, now there's even more on my plate. It can almost like start you feeling a little bit resistant to doing those things of like screw
Yes.
my Pilates class, I'm going to just like scroll on my phone, right? I think that's a spot where again the acknowledgement and the noticing is really helpful, right? Like I used to love my Pilates class, why am I angry about it right now? Why am I resistant to like putting on my workout clothes and doing that? And then ask yourself the question, like that's a kind of moment for curiosity of like, what's going on? Like, I just have too much on my plate. Like, I can't enjoy the Pilates class if it's like dinner up to 30 seconds right before then. And like, I don't have time to shower afterwards and I'm so like exhausted. Like, what does that mean? Maybe that means you need to ask for more help from your spouse. Maybe that means you need to take something off your kid's plate, right? Sometimes, often we think of self care as these like, yoga classes and like bubble baths and these kinds of things. But true self care, as we talk about it in the course, is asking these hard questions, right? It's saying like something has to give. Like it is normative that this doesn't make sense that I have too much stuff on my plate. What can I get rid of, right? And sometimes you can find ways to get rid of stuff. Not always, right? I think it's worth acknowledging all the same structural problems that the Surgeon General talked about, right? He came up with these sort of individual solutions that we're talking about right now. Well, what can a parent do in the moment to maybe change their self-talk or behave differently or something? Those are things we can do as individuals. But of course, the Surgeon General was talking about massive structural changes that we needed, right? Like, so that two parents don't have to all be working all the time or spending more time on childcare, right? Like, we need those things to happen kind of together, right? Kind of in concert, and so that we can make these kind of big changes. But as an individual, I think you need to, when you take a moment to recognize that something has to give, that not all of these things are possible, it can just allow you to take a breath, right? So maybe that means like dinner doesn't have to be as elaborate, right? We can give your kid like a little bit less exciting stuff, or maybe some unhealthy, quicker stuff. Maybe it means kind of giving yourself a little bit more latitude with screens early on, or asking for help more so you don't have to look like the perfect parent. For older kids, it might look like taking something off their plate. They don't need dance class and piano and soccer, right? You saving that extra hour and giving yourself a break so that you can, get in that workout that you really need is going to be better for everyone, including your kids, right? And so I think a lot of times we need to notice and get curious when those shoulds are feeling like shoulds, when the stuff we should be like really excited to take on because it's going to be good for us is starting to feel like a chore. And then ask and kind of take time to see like, why is that happening, right? And journaling here, which again sounds cheesy and like another thing you have to put on your plate, but like 10 minutes of journaling in the morning when you're coffee, or you're thinking about why does this feel so overwhelming, can sometimes be the like release you need to get curious and see what's going on.
I really like the idea of, instead of trying to squeeze in extra things that will hopefully make you feel better, to just take things away. That's a new
Yes.
way of
Yeah.
looking at it. And even just like you said, making dinner less elaborate, and then also hopefully not feeling the guilt that comes with that.
Yes. Not beating yourself up when you
Yeah,
do
just
that.
letting yourself do less so that you can feel better is a more approachable strategy than add in the 10-minute routine after your kids go to bed of doing XYZ.
I think we forget that we can subtract to get towards well-being. We think it has to be a new app or a new routine or a new whatever, but like taking stuff away can be huge. And one of the things we talk about in the course is that studies really show that taking stuff away doesn't hurt kids in the way we think. This is especially true for slightly older kids, where I think parents are kind of spending a lot of time like shuttling kids between different extracurricular activities, right? You want your kid to be good at sports and to learn an instrument and to have, math tutoring or whatever it is. But when you add all that stuff up, it's miserable for you and it's miserable for them, right? They don't have time to play or kind of take a break too. And economists have kind of gone through to ask, like, okay, what would it look like if everyone with all these activities took an hour less work off kids' plates? And what they find is that it actually would be correlated with higher levels of mental health, and it wouldn't hit them academically. Because again, a lot of these extracurriculars are like things to like, boost their resume so they can get into the perfect college. But what they find is like basically taking an hour off is not going to like mess them up in terms of the benefits they're getting from stuff, and it's probably going to boost their mental health if you look at correlations between numbers of activities and mental health and so on. And so what I say is like subtract, do it less good, right? I think the like good enough parent is like a really good strategy to go for. Your kids are not going to notice, right? They don't know the kind of parenting strategies that you see on Instagram. They don't see, the decorative like meals that you find on Pinterest or TikTok or whatever. They just know that you're present with them and not frustrated and pissed off at dinner, right? So whatever you need to do to achieve that, to get the right emotional balance, that is good. And it's worth giving yourself grace for that. You have to kind of struggle with the guilt that comes with that. But again, if ultimately your goal is to have a kid that felt loved and safe and present with you, like you're going to be better off doing that if you can take some stuff off your plate.
To the point of the extracurriculars, this has always felt like a catch-22 in my mind because in a perfect world, it's easy to say, take things off your kids' plate. They shouldn't be doing as much. Just let them go play. And the truth is, if everyone around you had that mindset and your whole community, for example, felt the same way about the topic, then yes, your kid would be able to not participate in 10 extracurricular activities and simultaneously wouldn't feel behind compared to their peers. But
Mhm.
because each family doesn't really exist in a vacuum, it's so much easier said than done to tell a parent to parent good enough and to take these things off their kid's plate, because how do you reply to the parent that says, of course I want to do that. That sounds like a better, happier life for me and my child, but then just given the society that we live in, they're going to fall behind in certain areas or they're not going to excel and they need XYZ number of courses to get into a college. And every parent is hopefully, I don't know, every parent's probably just trying to set their kid up for success in the best way, but then they're teetering this fine line between pushing
Mhm.
them too far and doing just enough.
Yeah. Well, I think start by acknowledging that this is hard, right? It is a fine line. Every parent is trying to do their best. They're trying to do it in a world where there's so much more social comparison than you've ever seen before, right? Not just like the parents in your community, but the parents that you see on TikTok and the trad wives and the
Right.
perfect moms and the all, they're just like everywhere, right? So like acknowledge like it is hard. It is hard and it's differentially hard like right now than it ever was before, right? So like validate, yes, this is tricky. But there's this kind of interesting question about where these social comparisons come from. You use the phrase like, how's my kid going to deal with the fact that their friends are like doing so much more? My guess is that those values aren't necessarily coming from the kids, right? They're coming from the adults, right? Like there's no
Totally.
like, perfect God-given list in the 10 commandments of like, this is how many AP classes your kid needs to take, or this is how many hours they need to spend at soccer practice, right? Like we are creating these norms and we are kind of infecting our kids with our own values of hustle culture and do more, 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 right? There's a separate question about like, how much do you need? And I think when you look at the real studies on this, it just seems to be less than we think. Now, it is much easier to be making those changes and kind of getting your kid out of the hustle culture and allowing your kid to subtract and allowing your family to subtract if the rest of your community is doing that too. But I think it starts with having these conversations, right? It starts with kind of being a less judgy parent than yourself. If you hear your friend take their kid out of ballet practice, then you don't be like, well, their kid's never going to get into Yale. Like, they're never going to amount to like, how are they going to learn to dance, right? Like, I think we need to be a little less judgy. But I do think that the collective action is a strategy forward here. And I think this is the kind of thing that can happen in school systems with things like homework. Again, if you look at older kids, and you don't have to get that much older, right? Even in grade school, we're talking about levels of homework that kids hate, that teachers hate because they have to grade it, that parents hate because they have to do it, right? There's a
The
real
parents have
world
to
where,
do it.
yeah, because we're doing the algebra too, right? Because we're probably stepping in more than we should to help, if we're being honest, right?
Yep.
But it's like miserable for everybody, and so this becomes a kind of collective action problem, right? Where if the parents could somehow find a way to get together with the schools, like we could kind of come up with a solution where everyone steps back a little bit. It's almost like kind of a nuclear arms situation where all these countries have like stockpiled these nuclear weapons. And you're like, well, we have to kind of, get together and agree to like get rid of our arsenal of weapons. I think the same thing has to happen with extracurriculars, with homework, and also with phones,
I
right?
was just going to say this sounds just like with smartphones because no one wants to be the one person who doesn't allow their kid to have a phone in a school where everyone else has it, and then you're harming them socially maybe,
Mhm.
versus if the whole community agrees we're waiting until 18, then no one's left in the dust.
Yes. And I think those collective action problems have been kind of solved at some schools, or a lot of schools have kind of done this of like, we're just going to have a norm where, no smartphones until age 16 or no smartphones until age 18. And so I think it's worth remembering that we're not just individuals, we're part of communities. And I think this is where the kind of guilt and the like, this is only me struggling can really mess parents up. I think so many parents feel like it's only them, right? It's only my kid who can't somehow juggle the perfect dinner and all these extracurriculars at once. And it's only me that's feeling like I'm failing. But if you have this moment of kind of common humanity where you're like, no, literally every family in my community must be feeling the same thing, even though we don't talk about it, then you can realize that it's not just you. Then you can realize that we really do have a collective action problem to solve and that we could all all get together and do a little bit better. I think the like silent, it's just me that's struggling, it's just me that's having a hard time, is actually preventing a lot of us from kind of figuring out ways that we can do these collective action solutions.
So I probably should have mentioned this before, but Dr. Santos, in addition to having the new course for parents on your podcast, The Happiness Lab, which is one of my favorite shows, I've talked about it here on The Real Stuff before, you have a new parenting series that you're coming out with where you're bringing on experts like Glennon Doyle and Dr. Becky and talking about all things parenting and stress. And I think it's just a vital listen for any parents in my audience. And there was one episode recently, I think it was just about the stress of parenting in general. And there was one topic that really stuck out to me. It's kind of related to pushing your kids with all these extracurriculars, but I've never known what is the right answer or what is the right way to be as a parent when it comes to pushing your kid in general from an academic standpoint. Because I think my parents pushed me in as healthy of a way as a parent can push you, where they really did prioritize school and grades. However, I never felt like it was a reflection of their love for me, or my validity as a member of the family was never tied to how I was doing in school. But I did feel pushed and a desire, a drive to do well because I knew that they wanted me to do well. And I feel like there's two sides of this pendulum. There's the side of if a child gets an A minus on a test, the parents look at them and say, "What happened? Where were your other 5 points?"
Yeah.
And then there's the other side where I heard a story recently where someone got a D on a test and her mom celebrated that. And the response was, "You passed." The mom was so excited for her and they went out for ice cream. And I hear both of these and I think, I don't know that either of these is, I don't know if there's a right way or a perfect way to do it. But I heard the D story and I went to my husband and I was like, how cool is that? I think that is so cool. And I want to be that mom who my child comes home and says, I got a D in chem. And I can say, "You passed the test. Let's go out for ice cream." Knowing, okay, she's not going to be a chemist, but maybe she'll be good at something else. And my husband was like, I don't know if you need to be celebrating a D. There's a healthy way to push them to give it their best shot and not make them feel bad when they're having a hard time. I don't know. There's this fine line and I just can't find it. And I'm honestly not anywhere close to this stage with my oldest being in the threes. But is there a right way to do this? Is there a perfect spot on that spectrum that we can land?
Yeah, I think right and perfect, those are just words to get out of your vocabulary when you're talking about anything with parenting. Like, there's never going to be the perfect, right? Like, we're just going to do the best we can, right? But I think one thing to do if you really want to help your kids academically, and I think this is true for any kind of learning domain, even beyond academics, like tying shoes and the kind of stuff that applies to toddlers and stuff too, right? Is that we need a better theory about how kids learn and what motivates kids. I think sometimes we have a theory that like, well, kids, like their frontal lobes just aren't done yet. They can't do anything right. If I wasn't like on them about grades, like it would never happen, right? Which leads to one of two different practices. Kind of the first one you mentioned where it's like, I got to push, or they're never going to get good enough. A minus, not good enough, right? This is a kind of authoritarian mode. You're kind of like, like with almost like cracking the whips or drill sergeant, right? Critical kind of, but because and again, you're not trying to be mean. You're just like, otherwise, how would they succeed if I'm not on them all the time, right? Another version is the kind of permissive thing, like their frontal lobes aren't done. They're very fragile. So like we just have to like praise and please everything. And I probably need to step in to do it, right? They're always going to get a D, right? And so if they ever want to do better, I have to help with homework. And that kind of leads to this sort of overhelp, right? Which is probably not great for learning either, right? But both of these theories start from the idea that like your kid's brain's not really done yet. You really need to step in and help somehow. What if we just gave our kids a little bit more agency? What if we assume that they are little people, like doing their best, and that they actually have something to bring to the table about this? What if we gave them kind of a little bit more agentiveness than we usually do, right? And if you think about what you were like as a kid, if you can kind of think back then, especially what you were like as a teenager, you maybe like 11 and 12-year-old, what did you want most? Like you wanted most to like get older, like to be good at stuff, to do it on your own, to not have your parents tell you stuff, right? This is just like a universal theory of motivation, right? Which if somebody else is making us do it, we kind of want to do it a little bit less, right? Like the number one way to get somebody not to want to do something is to nag them about it, right? Like true for adults, but also true for like young people. goal, right? Like their evolutionary goal is to become agents themselves, right? And so, what studies by motivation psychologists, folks like David Yeager and others, have found is that if you can treat your kids like agents, if you can start from at least a framework where you assume that they know what they're doing, like that actually can often get them to like do better, right?
Mm.
So take the kid, who's studying for their test, right? You could be the authoritarian parent, like, you have to study, you have to study, you have to study. They're not going to want to do it, right? Or you can be like, well, let me force you to, make the study guide for you and do all this stuff for you. How are they going to feel? They're going to feel like you took away their agency. Even if they do well, they're not going to feel like it's theirs, right? Versus a parent who kind of assumes agentiveness. This is what researcher David Yeager calls collaborative troubleshooting. You say, I think, you have that test coming up too. I know you've thought about like how you're going to do it. Like, I'm just curious, like, what's your approach to it? You're old enough to kind of figure out how to study on your own. Like, I'm just curious what you're thinking about, right? Couple things there. One is like, you're on the level with them. You're kind of helping them remember they're supposed to like come up with some study thing, but you kind of assume that they've come up with a path. And often if you take that approach, what you find with kids is like, they'll tell you something that's actually not that crazy pants, right? They'll say something like, well, what I'm planning to do is like, this is the week that I'm going to get off TikTok, or like, I don't really need to study for this one until Thursday. I think I have more time, right? Like, they might not be perfect because again, their frontal lobes aren't done, but they probably have some idea. Like, they're not a blank slate at figuring this out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is collaborative troubleshooting, right? Once you get that answer, you can say, well, I think that's good. It's great that you've thought about this. I'm curious, like, just ask questions like, well, do you really not, do you really think Thursday is enough time? But like, I'm curious how you came up with the idea of Thursday. Like, what about math is kind of making you think that that's enough time to kind of figure out algebra and that, right? Again, not being pedantic, not like asking questions that you already know the answer to, genuinely getting curious. And this is kind of asking questions to get kids a little bit closer. And this is, again, a strategy we can use in all these different kinds of domains. Even with a toddler, like, who's doing something, I don't know, they're like playing with the fork in front of the, pet cat. And it's like, I wonder if we like, it's so interesting that you're doing that. Like, I wonder what Fluffy is thinking about. How do you think Fluffy thinks about the fork? Like, again, you're not being like, I'm sure Fluffy hates the fork. Like, you're getting them to promote thought, right? This is called like provoking thought. And it works even with the youngest kids, right? Incidentally, also works with partners too, right?
Mm.
Like, it's kind of like, 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 is this April? Like, I wonder when tax season's coming up. Like, how are you thinking? How are you thinking we should do this? Like, again, I'm not implying what I think at all. I'm just really curiously trying to get your opinion on things. This is powerful because it works. It works in two ways. One is like, if you're not nagging your kid, they're going to be more motivated to do it. But the second thing is like, sometimes they've already figured it out. Like, sometimes they didn't actually need your help, right? And they're onto something on their own. And all you have to do is not do it for them, but just kind of tweak a little bit along the edges, right? And when they come up with the idea themselves, right? If you ask a question that they answer, that's what's going to make them learn it. Like, versus you kind of telling them, right, what to do. You're kind of showing, not telling, right? And that can be so important for kids to learn.
First of all, I really appreciate you calling me out for my use of the word perfect, because I do find
It's in there, right? It's not just you. I think parents just have this like, there's a right way. There's a right way. There's some Easter egg to perfect parenting to
yes.
get the kids that are, beautiful and perfect and go to Yale and make a ton of money. If we could just find that Easter egg, we'd sort it out. There's not, right? Like, it's just how people grow up. But yeah.
I think I'm speaking for a lot of parents and almost all parents, especially with all the content we follow and the data and the tips and the scripts we're following. We are trying to do things, maybe not perfectly, but as good as possible, and
Mm-hmm.
finding what does the science say today and what are we supposed to be doing today when it comes to feeding babies and teaching them to walk and their hip mobility. And it's like, there's so much data. It's hard to not want to be perfect. And so I appreciate you calling out that that's not the language we should be looking for. Also, with everything you were just saying, it really was becoming clear to me how many parallels there are to partnership and relationships, and specifically around the concept of offering someone direct support for something when that's actually the least effective way of helping them through a problem, how they actually might need more indirect support. This is something I've been working on with my therapist. If someone comes to me with a problem, I've noticed you're really good at this. I have a lot of trouble validating their emotions and coming to the table with just nothing but empathy and not trying to help them and fix it and offer strategies, which can then feel overwhelming to them in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, my therapist has suggested that I approach every conversation like that in my life as if I'm hosting my podcast.
Mm.
I just get curious,
Mm-hmm.
ask questions, and I love applying that lens to kids or teens and trying to not tell them what to do and offer all this direct support and be coaching and guiding all the time, but to really come at it from a place of curiosity and ask questions that then allow them to think critically and open up and then hopefully make their own decisions. And we all know at the end of the day, you're not going to, you unloading your philosophy about the world or your thoughts on something to someone else isn't going to be the thing that triggers them to make some sort of change in their life. That's going to come about from an internal place. And so the most you can do is pique their interest, get curious, ask questions, get them talking, get them thinking so that they can get to that place themselves.
Yeah. And I think the curiosity also helps because sometimes we're like solving for the wrong problem, right? David Yeager, this motivational psychologist who was on my podcast, told this story of, a parent who had a teenager who, goes out and does the thing teenagers do. They went to a party and got drunk and like, came home sloppy and whatever. And the parent's instinct was like, what is wrong with you? Do you not respect me? Do you not respect your body? Do not care. Like, but no, okay, back up, get curious. Like, I know you're a good kid. Like, I'm just curious what happened. Like, I just want to I'm sure you're smart enough to think through this carefully and that something went wrong. And I just kind of want to understand your thought pattern. So like, help walk me through like what went down, right? Totally different approach than I'm screaming at you, whatever. Assume the kid is smart, right? You do that and then the kid says something like, well, I knew there was going to be like drinking and drugs at this party, but like I had two friends that were there, two female friends, and they were feeling really vulnerable, right? So I wanted to like be there to like help them, right? And I thought if I was there, but it was really hard once I was there not to participate in it, blah blah blah, right? Before, if you're just like, this person doesn't respect me or they don't get that this is wrong, like you would have been telling them stuff they already know. So if you're screaming at them like, don't you realize this is bad? They're like, yes, mom, I know it's bad, because they did know that, right? What they and you missed out on a thing that they were doing that you were kind of proud of. Like you might be like, oh, that's really good. I really respect that you want to support your friends, and I get how important that is to you, and that makes me proud of you. That's a value that I really want to support. But it seems like maybe we need some strategies in the moment to like do this better. Like I'm not going to tell you them because I know you probably have thought about this and come up with some. Like, what are you thinking about doing next time? Like, what would you do differently, right? Like totally different attitude than kind of just the telling. And so that's the key to curiosity, is like sometimes if we assume like we're not getting the right answer, right? It'd be nice if all our kids' behavior came with that like perfect car alert signal of like they're tired, they're hungry, or whatever, right? When they're really little, it's hard to ask. But the good news is like once they hit, 5 or 6, like once they get a little bit of verbal human language, asking them can sometimes like help. And even with the youngest kids, you can sometimes get access to this stuff, right? I think a different thing that you mentioned before, though, that I want to pick up on is this idea of kind of being perfect and so on, and how that can get in the way of our relationships. Because sometimes what we need to do to take stuff off the plate, to like let others help us, is to do it not in the way we think is the quote unquote right way or the perfect way. And I get this in my own life, even not being a parent, right? I'll be feeling overwhelmed, and I'll like, my husband will say like, oh, you need some, it's a lot going on with podcast stuff and teaching, whatever, you need some help, right? I'm like, yeah, like I need some help. Like, can you, I don't know, make dinner, load the dishwasher, whatever, right? Like maybe go to the grocery store and pick up these things, and he'll go to the grocery store and like, that was not the tomato sauce I would buy. Or like he loads the dishwasher, like, you put the spatula in this part, like the spatula doesn't go there. Like that makes people not want to help you, right? And so like to accept help, you need to like loosen the strategies a little bit and soften on what you think is perfect. And if you do that, that often means you can get your kids to help, right? One of the reasons the Surgeon General's report found that parents are so busy is that they're taking on tasks that 10, 20 years ago they would let their kids do. Like kids 10, 20 years ago, like helped with the laundry, cleaned up the house, like cleaned up after dinner, did the dishes, did chores, right? Kids these days aren't doing that as much. And I think that's in part because we're like so focused on academics and this other stuff that they don't have time either. So parents pick up the slack. But I think it's partly because we've seen so many like perfect TikTok mom influencers, and the houses are perfect and the dinners are perfect, that we don't let them like chime in and help, right? But even the youngest kids, not baby babies, but even toddlers can kind of start to help. They can help set the table, they can move stuff, they can help mom with cooking. Probably going to spill stuff. It might not be perfect, but like they can actually get going and get started a little bit. And so, but to do that, we need to kind of reject this notion of right and perfect and so on, and kind of soften. And that can let us accept help that can sometimes for our time wind up helping us a ton.
Yes, and I think getting comfortable with the fact that that's actually good for your toddler. Sometimes it can feel like you're being
Yes.
mean to them or you're, not being a good parent. But there's a phrase I've heard a lot. I forget which podcaster. I listen to this podcast a lot, and she talks a lot about. I'll try to put it in the show notes if I can remember. She talks a lot about how she doesn't do anything for her children that they can do for themselves, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a philosophy that I love. I can't say I'm doing it because my 3.5-year-old's not making his own bed, or, he can brush his own teeth, but sometimes I do it better and more thoroughly. So there are
Mm-hmm.
many things that I am doing for him, but I am trying to adopt it in little ways that are actually really helpful to me. Sometimes it makes me feel like I'm being lazy, but I actually have told myself, this is actually in his best interest. So
Yes.
if it's time for dinner, instead of going and getting his plate and cup, I say, okay, go get your stuff. We put it in a low drawer so that he can reach everything and access everything. We're trying to make his
Yes.
snacks
Mm-hmm.
and a little cup of water accessible for him so he can go and pour his own water. He can now go get his cup. He knows how to open the fridge. There's the tap right there that he could fill. And so these little tiny things that he could do himself, we're sort of offloading from our own chore
Yes.
list. And it's like, if you want a snack, if you want water, serve yourself.
I love that. I mean, it's so tiny, but like that's just another thing when you're, nursing the baby, getting something ready, trying to finish up at work that you don't have to do. You're saving yourself these little 5-minute things. And at the same time, your toddler becomes agentive. They know how to do it themselves. And in some ways they're helping you. I think this is another motivation that we forget little kids have. Like somehow we've become these like kind of high-end concierges for our kids where we like, support them in every way. But like they're human too. They're part of the family. They don't like us seeing us overwhelmed and stressed. They kind of probably want to help too, right? And so we forget that kind of allowing others to help us is good for them, that this isn't like putting more on them. Sometimes it's like, especially if we're not forcing them to do it, not nagging them about it, like it can really be a kind of nice thing for them too to help out across the family. One of the earlier parenting episodes we did on the Happiness Lab had this woman, Michaeline Duclef, who was an NPR journalist who went and did a bunch of work on families in the Maya, right? Where there's less rates of mental health issues and less kinds of things. And it turned into a book for her because one of the things she noticed was that like in Mayan families, even the littlest kids are doing stuff like they're cooking, they're like setting the table, they're doing this stuff, and they're doing it without having to get nagged about it. And so she became curious, like what's kind of going on. And there's just like a different set of values there for like what like families require young kids to do. Like it's just expected that like
Mm.
you would be helping and doing this kind of stuff, but it's not perfect, at least at first, right? So you also have to, again, when your toddler's getting their water, they might spill it sometimes. Like they might
As he
mess
does a
up.
lot, yes.
They might grab the wrong thing, right? If you're having your kid help out with dinner, you probably need to let them have a little bit more say in what is at dinner, right? And kind of let them do it their way, right? In terms of like putting stuff on the plate and so on. So relaxing our perfection standards and realizing it doesn't have to be exactly the way we want it can allow our kids to help us more. And that can let us feel a little less overwhelmed.
Back to the mindset of parenting for your child when they're 30, and also the whole concept of where's the line between pushing them to be successful and then also just accepting them as they are and not pushing at all. One phrase that I've found myself using a lot with my toddler is I keep telling him, there's nothing you could do that will ever make me love you any less than I love you or any more than I love you. And I'm trying to tell him,
Mm-hmm.
if you got a really bad grade, that's not going to make me love you less. And if you are the star of the soccer field, I'm not going to love you anymore for that. And this reminds me of your Glennon Doyle episode because it's hard to figure out how much intensity or how much praise we should put on them for the good things they're doing because we don't want to overdo that either. And I think about if you just think of a child on a soccer field, it goes back to the spectrum. There's the parent who is sitting there invested, and when the child makes one wrong move, they make a mean face and they get angry and their whole livelihood is reliant on the child doing well. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, one could argue that if a parent was completely uninterested and didn't get affected at all or didn't seem happy when the kid won or sad when the kid lost, that maybe the kid would feel like, well, my parent is detached emotionally. And so
Mm-hmm.
how do I try to tell him, I'm not going to love you anymore or love you any less, but I also want him to see that I'm happy for his successes and sad for his failures. I don't know how to describe that, but
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I love that phrase, right? Because I think a lot of parents get like, I'm not going to love you any less. But I like the part about like, and I'm also not going to love you anymore, right?
right.
You're at like kind of ceiling effect of love, and like what you do is not going to matter for that, right? I mean, that just teaches kids that like the circumstances don't matter as much, right? I think you are trying to strike this sort of happy medium. But one way to do that is to be happy for them, to ask them, how are you feeling after the game, right? And reflect that kind of back to them, right? And to remind them that like there's just circumstances in life that they don't have control over. So after a bad game, ask like, well, what do you think you did differently? Like, what did you learn from this, right? Like kind of remind them that there's like something that they could get out of a bad situation, just like you would do hopefully for an adult friend, right? You're trying to lead people back to being compassionate to themselves. But I think if you celebrate the successes as your kids' successes, not your successes, right? Like, I'm happy that you're happy, right? That's kind of a little bit more what it's about. I also think a way to get around that kind of like being the soccer mom, that every single thing the kid does is like a reflection of your identity, is to make sure as a parent that you still have your own identity, right? That
Right.
there's things that you're proud of that like go beyond your kids, right? And I think having space to do your own activities, right? Having your kids not be the end all and be all, because that's all you have time to do, shuttling them between different activities. I think that's one way to kind of make sure your identities stay a little bit separate, which I think is important, right? One of the things we want to teach our kids if we're parenting for when they're 30 is that like adult life isn't miserable. It isn't overwhelming. You don't like, get snippy with your partner every time. It's not miserable to have kids, right? We want our kids to think that what they're growing into is going to be a good thing. And so I think maintaining a life that has its own separation from your kids can be a
Mhm.
really great lesson to teach them.
I love that. I want to round out this conversation just by touching a little bit on some other cultures and how they're parenting and how we can learn from them. I know you have a whole podcast episode about the Nordic culture and
Hmm.
raising children like Vikings. I read a book called Bringing Up Bebe about French philosophy of parenting. It seems like a lot of these other cultures are getting a lot of things right, or at the very least, their approach to parenting is making it so they, as the parents, just feel happier and
Hmm.
healthier and are having an easier time at it than we are here in America. So, just top line, what are some of the biggest learnings? What are some of the things we can take? And how can we actually infuse these things into our lives, even though we don't live there?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing to remember is that many of these countries have different structural practices for families too. Again, we're focused on the individual solutions, but I don't want to lose out on the structural things, right? Nordic countries have a lot of happier parents in part because they have universal incomes, they have caps on the number of hours parents work. There are lots of like social structures for parents and clubs and spaces they can take kids and like so on, right? So it's like those things definitely help too, right? But in terms of individual strategies, I think there are a few things that Nordic families are doing a little bit different, right? One is like a real emphasis on play. There's a joke in the podcast I had with Helen Russell, who's the woman who kind of promotes Viking parenting, that the Danes have like a bunch of different words for play, right? It's a land of Lego, like they kind of take it really seriously. But a lot of that kind of play is unstructured play, right? Letting your kids make little couch forts, like allowing a mess because it's going to let them kind of mess around and learn stuff, right? Not kind of having so many like structured activities from soccer to like, bowling or whatever it is, right? Like kind of giving your kids space to kind of mess around and play, ideally without screens. That seems to be a kind of big one, right? Another one is that there's a real emphasis on kind of not overparenting your kids, just like really giving them independence. And independence in some ways that like I think to Americans sound like kind of ridiculous, right? Helen talks about in her head of toddlers like daycare, they let the kids just go like roam around outside, often with like tools like knives and things that they can use to kind of mess around. And it's like,
Wow.
then you're like, oh my gosh, they might get hurt. And Helen's like, yeah, they might get hurt. And like, then they'll learn not to hurt themselves. Like, they're probably not going to like have to go to the hospital. It's probably going to be something minor. And oh my gosh, what a great learning opportunity, right? Like, that's the attitude. And I think it's just kind of like a letting kids be independent for much longer. One of the funny stories that Helen shared on the show is that even as babies, I think there's this emphasis on kind of like toughening them up a little bit. So much so that the Danes believe that cold weather is really helpful for babies. So one of the things they do is that, they also have these like, industrial size, like, strollers, right? But they don't ever try to bring those industrial size strollers into like a cafe or a restaurant or something. They believe that it's good for babies to be outside a lot. So they just like leave the strollers outside. So imagine like rolling into like a Starbucks in the middle of New York, and outside like that Starbucks in Brooklyn, there's just like 10 strollers with babies in it just sitting there outside while
Yes,
parents
I've
are
seen the
inside.
pictures.
Yeah. So it's like, and then it's like, oh my gosh. And they even have a saying like, no one steals babies in Denmark. But the point is like, what a different cultural move. Like, not
Mhm.
like even a baby, you're not like kind of hovering over and watching all the time. It's like, they need some time to kind of be independent, to like toughen up a little bit. Right. And so those kinds of changes I think are important, in part because they have an effect on kids' development. It maybe does toughen them up. It maybe does allow them to learn, how to handle a little bit trickier situations. But I think it's also really essential for parents because it gives parents a little bit more space, right? Parents are allowed to be adults. I think there's also lots of evidence that Danish parents ask for help from their kids more often. One of the stories Helen told is that for alarm clocks, it tends to be the case that parents start letting even like 5 and 6-year-olds like wake themselves up. And she says, you
Wow.
just have this conversation where it's like, you're an adult and there's like, you're like old enough now that you should be waking yourself up. It's kind of silly and like a little bit weird for your parent to be waking you up. So I'm going to give you this cool new alarm clock. And it's just going to be like another duty that you have is to wake yourself up. Right. And like, they might not for a while, but then if you set the value right and you really give them agency over it, like eventually they're going to figure it out. Right. And so those are the kinds of changes that I think kind of give kids agency, let them learn, but also take things off parents' plates so parents aren't so overwhelmed all the time.
My big takeaway from my conversation with you about how parents can reduce their stress, maybe feel a little happier, and feel a little bit less anxious about doing everything perfectly for their kids is to actually just do less. We're all
Yes.
doing
Yes.
more. We need to just take things off our plate, let our kids do more things for themselves, not try to teach them as much as we're trying to teach them, not try to infuse them with as many activities and skills and as much knowledge as we think they need. Leave them for unstructured play. Let them do things for themselves. And the fact that that's actually what the science is saying is going to be better for them should remove the guilt from you as the
Yes.
parent, and then free up that time for you to go to that Pilates class or go get coffee with a friend and not be thinking that in every waking minute you need to be planning your child's life away.
Yeah, I think that's a massive philosophy. Like, we're just never going to be perfect. So, like, let's just kind of have a kind of radical acceptance of that and do a little bit less. And I think we as parents will feel happier, and our kids will probably feel happier too.
I love this. It was a major unlock for me, and I'm about to share this with all of my friends, both moms and dads. I think that's another point. I have a huge community of mom friends, and dads don't tend to do things as much together as dads where they can
Hmm.
unwind and connect and feel that community. And actually, my husband was just invited to this event in our town. I think it was called Dads and Donuts. It's basically like a dad group. They said, bring your kid or don't and come have donuts and just chat. And I think it's the best thing that has ever happened because he's been at a loss for that community the way I've had it since my son was 6 months. He's never had anything like that for dads. And we all just need community and to get together and then to leave our kids and let them grow. So thank you so much for this chat. It was really insightful for me. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot. Tell people where they can find you if they want to take your free course on parenting or just the science of well-being. Where can they find those? Let us know what you're excited about that's coming up for you.
Yeah, so you can check out all these things at my website, which is drlauriesantos.com/parents. So that's drlauriesantos.com/parents, or just Google Yale Parenting Class. And I hope you'll check out the podcast because we've been just so excited to share these resources with parents. Again, like parents are having a tough time. It's completely makes sense that parents are having a tough time, but there are ways we can take stuff off our plate and parent better, not by doing more, but hopefully by doing less.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on. I will link the Happiness Lab down below as well. Everyone go give it a listen. And we loved having you on The Real Stuff.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Real Stuff podcast. If you're liking the show, please head over to Apple or Spotify and leave the show a written review. If you're watching on YouTube, drop a comment down below and join in the conversation. And if you're feeling called to be a guest on the show, visit luciefink.com/apply and tell us your story. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your attention with us, and we will see you next time on the Real Stuff Podcast.
Please note that this episode may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products and services. Individuals on the show may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to in this episode.